Welcome, entrepreneurial agent listeners. Today, I have the distinct privilege and honor to welcome a great friend of mine as a guest to our show, Larry Colorito. Larry is a commercial appraisal expert. He's a senior managing director for Valbridge Property Advisors, a national appraisal company. Larry's based here in the eastern part of Virginia, the Chesapeake, Virginia Beach area, Virginia. Larry, welcome to the show.
So I'll tell you what I tell my students when I teach. Basically, valuation is a fundamental part of whatever you do in real estate. And if you think about it, if you don't understand what the value of the property is, then you're going to have a difficult time being successful in whatever capacity you operate in the real estate business. If you want to own property, you better have a good idea of what it's worth. If you want to sell or buy property, either as a principal or as a broker representing principals, you better have a good idea of what it's worth. If you're going to manage property, you're going to base some of your decisions at least on what the property is worth. So understanding valuation theory is fundamental to success in real estate. So where my job is to tell you what the property is worth, and that's the end in and of itself. Paul, your office building is worth X. You as an owner or as in some other capacity may say, okay, if my office building is worth X, then what, how do I buy it, sell it, position it, whatever. But either way, you have to understand what the value of the property is. Maybe not as precisely as I do, but you have to have a general idea. Otherwise, you're not going to have a good place to start, no matter what capacity you operate in the profession.
Well, that makes sense. And then, so as an owner, my building is worth X. You say that gives me sort of a starting point to determine, oh, okay, maybe something as simple as what's my net worth? Do I want to sell? What's this? How does this play into my overall portfolio? But then also, you as a everyone thinks what they have is generally worth a lot more than it is, right? My home is my castle, and even though it's a single wide, down by the sea, so to speak, right?
Right.
So your function is you're really that third party, disinterested, non-emotional, party that says, okay, I'm gonna take all that out of this and I'm gonna assign a value. But even that is somewhat subjective, right? I mean, how in the world do you determine, what my building is worth?
Yeah, I mean, there's some subjectivity. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But the entire reason that valuers exist is to provide that what we like to call independent third party opinion of value, right? If you look at the uniform standards of professional appraisal practice that we have to adhere to, all over it says, thou shalt not be biased. And so it doesn't matter what my client wants, quote unquote, for a value. I have to fly right down the middle of the road. And why is that important? Well, every other person involved in a real estate transaction has a vested interest. The buyer wants to buy, the seller wants to sell, the broker has a vested interest in the transaction occurring. Believe it or not, even the attorneys have a vested interest because attorneys are paid advocates for their client's position. So whatever their client's position is, that's their position, or that's at least what they're arguing for. I'm the only guy, to borrow a colloquialism, that doesn't have a dog in the fight, right? And so I'm the guy who comes in and says, without any vested interest, this is what the property's worth. And that's valuable to my clients because they know that I don't have any reason to pump the number high or to push the number low. I'm just going to tell them the truth. And that's what appraisers do. And that's why every real estate loan has to have an appraisal tied to it. So there's somebody who doesn't have an interest in the deal going through telling them their opinion of value.
No, that is interesting, and I think it's to me it seems like it would be critical, for the success really of the markets, because you're right. I didn't really consider or think too much about it before, but literally everybody has an interest in what is the value, and they're all there. Nobody is like disinterested. They all have. The seller wants the most money they can get. The buyer wants to get as cheap as they can get. I mean, people are have commissions involved that are based on things, valuations and that sort of thing. But you're the one guy. So you're on the island and you've got the sharks swimming all around you, right? You take all the bullets.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've heard me say this, but I say it all the time to people. Appraisers are not in the people pleasing business.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's what we do. And there is some subjectivity to it. And so we can have a discussion, right? About, here are my findings, Mr. Client, and we can have a discussion, but a good appraiser is going to have his ducks in a row. He's going to hand you a report that's chock full of the data that he used and the analysis that he used to come up with his conclusions. And, again, something else I say all the time, I don't like your value because it's not high enough or low enough isn't a good argument. A good argument is, well, here's something you did wrong, or here's a piece of information that you missed, or anything that nobody's perfect. And so, show me. You can't say, well, I agree with everything in the report, but I don't like your answer. That that doesn't work.
You can say it all day long, but it doesn't change your opinion of value, right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
So, okay. All right. So you're the guy that says this property is worth, based upon all of your professional experience, all the data sources that you can pull together, market conditions and all that, and you're the one that's disinterested. You don't get a commission on the value of the property or whatnot. So you're that guy. So talk to me about this. So how do you determine value though? What are some of the key components that you look for in the commercial world? Residential, we're pretty much just looking at sales price essentially and comparable.
Right.
I know commercial is quite a bit different. And I think it's when people first get in commercial and they see their first commercial appraisal, they're kind of blown away at how extensive those reports are,
Right.
compared to residential.
Yeah, the residential appraisal is going to be that 7 or 8 page, I don't even know anymore, form. And that's fine because, you that's how the market is looking at residential properties, right? They're saying these other properties that are similar are selling for X, and adjusted for a few differences, my property should sell for X, and that's totally appropriate. In the commercial world, we're writing narrative reports, and they're, depending upon the property, 25 to 100 pages long, and we're filling it with the information and the discussion about the market and things like that. So there's three there's three approaches to value and appraisal, and when you look at residential, you just see the one because that's the only one that really applies. There's three, though. There's the sales comparison approach, which is the one you're used to seeing in residential property. That can apply to commercial, does all the time. Same theory. Here's what similar office buildings to your office building are selling for, and adjusted for some of the differences, here's my conclusion of value for yours, just using office as an example. There's the income approach, because, although in residential, you do have people who own residential as investments and lease them, that's not the primary reason, right? The primary reason is shelter. Right. But in commercial, oftentimes it's an investment property, right? If you own a 40 tenant office building, you didn't buy it to occupy it. You might occupy a small portion of it, but you're leasing out the rest of the space. So the income approach says this building is worth the income it's going to throw off net of expenses. So the net income it's going to throw off divided by some rate of return. So theoretically, if the net income of the property were $100,000 and the market wants a 10% return for an investment like that, then the property is worth $1 million, right? Because $100,000 is 10% of $1 million. Or said another way, I'm paying $1 million to get $100,000. That's the market would pay $1 million to get $100,000 a year in income.
And that's what you would define as the cap rate, right?
That's the cap rate, right? Okay. The 10% is the cap rate. And that's for investment property, that's the gold standard. That's the primary way to value it. If it's not an investment property, if it's something that's more owner occupied, Mr. Jones bought the warehouse to put his manufacturing operation in, then we're back to the sales comparison primarily. And then the third approach is the cost approach, which basically says, hey, this property's worth no more than I can rebuild it for, less depreciation, of course, unless it's a new building, then there is no depreciation. That tends to be the least applicable approach. Not always, because there are some times where it's applicable, but it's the least real world because, people don't look at a building and say, they might say I can reproduce it for this as a
Mhm.
benchmark, but they rarely then go to the next step and say, but there's depreciation and that depreciation is this much, because we're talking about aging, not the IRS,
Mm.
depreciation standard. We're talking about, like, you and I age, buildings age, and so you have to factor in that. So that's the least real world in many cases, but it is the third approach to value.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so based on the application of the real estate itself, you're going to put some weighting on one of the three approaches: sales, comparison, income, or the cost. Mostly income approach for the investment properties, and you're going to lean a little heavier on the sales comp for the owner occupied buildings. We see a lot of like small, chiropractors or veterinarians or whatever,
Yep,
buying their own building.
right.
That would be more of probably a sales comparison approach, right? As an owner occupied.
Yeah, and we do a lot of that work, and that's where I'm saying the cost approach sometimes does have merit, because especially when you get into some of the veterinary hospitals, I'll use those as an example.
Mhm.
If it's a real state-of-the-art veterinary hospital, those things don't lease necessarily that often because they're usually, built to suit
Mhm.
Dr. So and so.
Right.
And that's where the cost approach can be a valid approach to look at it, because of all the cost of the finishes that are involved in something that is that sophisticated on the medical basis. But yeah, it's primarily a sales comparison approach when it comes to stuff like that. And it's primarily an income approach when it comes to stuff that is going to be purchased to lease to a third party.
Gotcha. And that so would that also apply on your sort of other special use type buildings, like maybe a car wash, if someone's building a car wash?
Yeah, the more special purpose, it's interesting that you use that term because that's exactly what it is. The more special purpose it is, the more likely that the cost approach has some validity, because the less likely it is that something like that will lease. And then the sketchier, if that's a word, some of the sales data is for the sales comparison approach. And so oftentimes, you'll benchmark things off of cost as a secondary method because, well, I guess primarily because we don't have any other data, but also because if you think about it, and I'm sure that your clients that are involved in this type of stuff would bear this out, you know, car washes cost X to build. The guy's going to look at what kind of return on investment he gets from building that car wash and the costs involved with acquiring the land, putting in the, building the four walls and the roof and putting in the machinery and equipment.
Mhm.
And so, you know, we don't make the market, we just try to reflect it. And so if the buyers and sellers are paying attention to cost, then we should be too.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what I found interesting in the commercial world, which is quite a bit different than residential, is just, I guess, the variation of property types that are out there. So we think, commercial and office building, we've talked about a few different types here, but you have everything out there, right? Manufacturing facilities, you have mobile home parks, you have, I mean, the list is retail, different kind of retail, right? Tenant anchored
Yep.
retail and all that. I mean, so you have to really have a pretty broad base of understanding of the real estate world to be effective in this space, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the kind words. I, I guess that's true. I mean, I'm kind of a general practitioner, to borrow a medical term. I do mostly what I consider the four basic food groups: retail, office, multifamily, and industrial. But I have partners at Valbridge who, they'll do all sort. I got one guy that does sanitary sewers. We joke him, we tell him he takes crap for a living. A
He's number one in the
hospital.
number two business.
Exactly. Yeah. We have another guy that specializes in hospitals, another guy that specializes in heavy industrial. Think of oil refineries and
Wow.
things like that. Hotels, the whole hospitality end of things, from mom and pop motel along the interstate all the way up to, the Bellagio in Vegas. That's a whole different world too. So yeah, there's when people say, And I love it. I've got clients that are heavy residential lenders and dabble in commercial. And so when they send me the request for proposal, they'll say, this is a commercial property. Can you give me a little bit more than that? What type of commercial property?
Which should be defined as anything that's
Not
larger than 1 to
residential.
4
Yeah.
units, right? Yeah, it's a big universe out there. I think I mean, that in of itself is a huge point, that if you're not in the commercial world, or maybe you're starting to get into the commercial world, how I mean, just vacuous it is. I mean, how big and unique and different that space is than residential. I know, again, it floored me the first time I explored it, and I had a conversation with you, and looking at one of these appraisals, I'm like, wow, this is a different world for sure. Um,
Yeah,
lot of factors.
it's probably a good idea to specialize, like if you're going to get involved as an investor, focus on one type of property.
Mhm.
On the other hand, from a small local perspective, if you've got good advice, and I'm not talking about just my type of advice, but a good broker, maybe a good property manager, if you're not going to do that yourself, then, you can kind of backfill what you don't know pretty easily. The key thing is not to just say, well, because I own a house, I can invest in shopping centers, or I can invest in office buildings or something like that. It is a different world, but it can be very profitable, and it's diversification, right? A lot of people have stocks and bonds in their portfolio, but real estate is really that third, other than precious metals and stuff like that. Real estate is
Mhm.
really that third piece of the puzzle that fewer people have.
Right. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, talking about that, without giving any investment advice or whatnot, but just what are you seeing in the market now? I know, different areas of commercial, can be hotter than other areas on the upswing or
Mhm.
the downswing. What are you experiencing in the market in terms of the hot trends, and maybe the trends, the areas to kind of stay away from right now, or losing favor in the market?
So I'll speak primarily from my own experience in the markets that I tend to cover, but with a little bit of national knowledge just from being in the business. So I'm in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, southeastern Virginia, however you want to look at it. And so most of my experience is going to be in Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic, just as a point of reference. But what's been hot recently, hottest, is multifamily, which is apartments,
Mhm.
and industrial. Those have been the two darling investments for quite some time now. We had, 2020 was an aberration across the board, right? COVID comes in, and for the better part of 2020, from March when everything got shut down, at least through the end of the year, if not maybe through the middle of 2021, nobody knew what was going on. But thankfully, as it turned out, both on the commercial and the residential side, we came out in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
So if you just pick that up and set it aside as an aberration, primarily in multifamily and industrial. So why is that? We have an undersupply of multifamily. We just can't seem to build it fast enough. We had a big baby boomer generation. We had a relatively small Generation X that I'm at the top of. And then we had a big millennial generation and a big Gen Z that our two kids are part of. And so demographics have worked in favor of needing a lot of rental property. Industrial has been propped up by all the, you think about it, you know where do people shop these days? Yeah, some people still go to the store, but a lot of people are on Amazon. Well,
Mhm.
Amazon's got to be able to ship their stuff, right? And not just from one place. I mean, here in our area, we've got one major facility that receives things from the port, because we have a big port here. And then we've got a bunch of smaller facilities that handle the distribution to your house. So that, they've got to have all these different facilities. So the whole idea of online shopping has really generated a lot of that need. In this area, the port generates a lot of that need. So industrial has done very well. Retail, believe it or not, retail takes a lot of grief, but
Mhm.
the demise of retail isn't across the board. Malls it seems like every major metropolitan area has one or two successful regional malls, and then three or four that have just completely fallen out of favor. I know that's true here. So malls, not so great as an investment, but you can go out there and find, the other thing that's not so great is what you call the power center, where you have Target, Best Buy, so and so and so and so, and then it's some satellite space. To the extent that some of those anchors are doing just fine, like Target and Walmart, okay, but so many of those bigger box retailers have fallen out of favor that those centers tend to have problems. But you can go to a little specialty center, 4 tenants down the street from your house. And if those 4 tenants are the right 4 tenants, if you've got Starbucks and Vitamin Shop and something else and something else, it's going to be strong.
Right.
And it's gonna be desired. So not all retail is created equal. And then the last of the four food groups, as I referred to earlier, has been office. And you know, office is kind of a crapshoot right now. We don't know how many people are going to return to the office building, although we're seeing it's probably going to be more than we originally thought. That it's not. During the depths of COVID, we thought nobody would ever go back to the office. So
Right.
that's probably overblown. But it has pointed out to a great degree to some people that not everybody has to be back in the office. So what happens? They contract their need for office space. That puts more space on the market, and that means that office buildings, aren't doing as well as they used to do.
Right. Well, what about this? What about the influence of green? Are you seeing that come into the market in a big way, or is it still also a lot of talk about something in the future?
No, it's real. On the commercial side, we have what's called LEED certified
Hmm.
and LEED. And to be honest with you, I don't even remember what LEED stands for, but basically it's a certification you get for building a green building. And from what I understand, there has to be some economies of scale. So it's got to be a pretty big building for it to be worth the money to spend the extra money to make it green.
Right.
But with all these systems in there, think about what drives investment property. You want higher rent, or at least more consistent rent, and you want lower expenses, right? So that your bottom line is higher.
Right.
Well, you've got lower expenses because you got better systems. So theoretically, you can operate your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning cheaper, for example. So that lowers your expenses. And then in some people's mind, not everybody, but they want to be located in these buildings, right? It's cool. Or, or it's either just because it's cool or because they really care about the environment, or a combination of both. But either way, they can create more demand for those buildings than something that doesn't. Now, everything's relative. Will they be willing to pay more?
Hmm.
That remains to be seen. But if you think about it, that should improve the bottom line. Now, the question then becomes, does it improve it enough to be worth the extra money it costs for the additional systems to build it? And the answer is not consistent. Sometimes it's yes, and sometimes it's no. But I will say this, you go up to like a place like DC, and the government's basically come out and said, we favor LEED certified buildings.
Mm.
So when the government, in the capital of the free world, makes up such a large portion of the tenant mix, now it starts to make more sense to take the plunge and put those systems in and stuff like that. So.
Right, right. So it sounds like, yeah, it sounds like it's for real, and I could see that if some people want to follow the lead of, I mean, it was the tip of the spear for a long time, a lot of talk, but now you see it becoming more pervasive, even with like the electric cars and things, and as the infrastructure electrifies, and you see all this farmland turned into satellite farms and
Right.
whatnot,
From
which.
a pure investment standpoint, though, if you're going to concentrate on smaller stuff, it probably doesn't make any sense because there isn't enough economies of scale over which to spread the cost.
Mm.
So if you're going to do it just because of the environmental, the positive to the environment, then that's great. But if you're doing it based on return on investment, you're probably not going to have the economies of scale to get that. So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So rolling along, change the subject here a little bit. Tell us something, in all of your experience, 35 years doing this, what is one of the most interesting or the funniest properties or experiences that you've had in the commercial appraisal world? You've had to have some really interesting things happen.
Yeah, the first story I can tell you, and I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version, was going back to my very first year in the business. I was born and raised in the New York metropolitan area, and I was working for a very well-respected appraiser. And at the time, the waterfront along the Hudson River in Jersey City had an old plant that was operated by Colgate-Palmolive, and it was being into what is there now, which is a bunch of office buildings, so that the Wall Street firms can have back office across the river where it's cheaper than in Manhattan. And that was just starting to happen. So the portions of the Colgate Palmolive plant were being demolished. So my boss says, go down to Jersey City and take pictures of this property. And this is back in the 35 millimeter camera, developed the negative days.
24 shots, right?
Right, 24 shots, and you didn't see them until they were developed. And
Right.
so I go down there, and these guys are demolishing who are demolishing this building. They, I guess, thought I was somebody who I wasn't. They thought I was there to check up on them in some way, shape, or form. Whether it was because they were doing something illegal or I don't know, but they were not happy. And all I was doing was walking around with my 35 millimeter Nikon taking pictures. Well, they start picking up pieces of concrete rubble from the demolition and throwing it at me. I'm 22 years old. I got to get these pictures from my boss, right?
Yeah.
So I start backpedaling, clicking photos. Fast forward a day later, the film comes back developed, and there's pictures of guys like throwing with a picture with a piece of concrete halfway to the camera. That kind of...
Oh man, that's hilarious. You're like, and you stayed in the business after this experience, huh?
I remember going home and telling my wife, I think I'm in the wrong business, but I wasn't 100% sure. And then the second one, it's really a combination of things, and this has to do with more residential stuff, apartments. Let's just say that, to keep it clean, that you never know what you're going to find when you walk into somebody's apartment. And the embarrassing thing, and these people are supposed to know the appraiser's coming, right? And a lot of times you're walking in with the landlord who's knock, 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 but it doesn't always work out that way. And embarrassing things, illegal, most of which I can't speak directly about. But you really start to figure out, how people live when you start to see some of these things.
Oh my gosh, man. Yeah, I've heard some stories on the residential side from people, from real estate agents that walked in and experienced some interesting things. But
I bet.
yeah, I can only imagine. What a fun thing. Well, Larry, we're about out of time, man. Tell us a couple things. So, Val Bridge, I know you're based here in Virginia, in the Mid-Atlantic, but you guys service the whole nation, I believe, don't you?
Yep. We have roughly 80 offices and cover basically the entire 50 states. We can do Hawaii and Alaska, but we don't have offices there. And we focus on commercial. We do have a few offices that do residential kind of as a legacy service, but it's primarily a commercial operation.
Excellent. And so, how would somebody get up with you guys, with you specifically, and then maybe your company if they had a need for a commercial valuation?
Well, you can always contact me. It doesn't really matter where the property is, because I will either get it done for you or put you in touch with one of my partners who can get it done for you. But our website is just what it would seem like, valbridge.com. That's V like Victor, A-L bridge.com. There's a search for appraiser function on there. You can kind of type in zip code or state or whatever, and it'll the appropriate office will pop up. You can call me directly if you want. It's 757-550-1138. I'm in Chesapeake, Virginia, right down the street from Virginia Beach. But like I said, if regardless of where the property is, I'll get it to the correct office if you need that kind of assistance.
Well, we'll get that all that in the show notes, and I can vouch for Larry. I've known Larry for quite a long time, and he's not only a super professional appraiser with all the right connections, but just a great guy and a great family. So, Larry, thanks for being on today. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Paul, thanks for having me, and I feel the same about you guys. Great friends and great people to be associated with.
All right, and go Nittany Lions, right?
Right here, man. Right here. That's the logo. Tech had an off year, but it's still a great school.
It's a rebuilding year. That's right.